Hey there, friend. Welcome back to another journey through history's darker corners, where we peel back the polished veneer of the past to reveal what life was really like for ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. Tonight, we're stepping into the blood-soaked sands of the Colosseum, but not as spectators cheering from marble seats. No, we're walking in the leather sandals of the men who died for Rome's entertainment. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. What city? What country? What time zone? Drop a comment and let me know. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all drifting through history together, scattered across the globe but united in our curiosity about the past. And if this kind of historical storytelling helps you unwind, feel free to subscribe. We have many more forgotten stories waiting to be told. Now, settle in. Pull your blankets closer. Let the modern world fade away, because tonight we're traveling back 2,000 years to a time when entertainment meant death, where fame came at the cost of freedom, and where the roar of the crowd was often the last sound a man would hear. You think modern athletes have it rough. You think the pressure on today's UFC fighters is intense. Imagine if every match was potentially your last. Imagine if losing didn't just mean a bruised ego and a smaller paycheck, but a sword through your chest while 80,000 Romans screamed for your blood. Welcome to the life of a gladiator. We romanticize them now, don't we? Hollywood gives us Russell Crowe, muscles gleaming, fighting for honor and freedom. Video games let us play as noble warriors earning glory in the arena. But strip away the cinematic sheen and you'll find something far more brutal, far more desperate. The gladiator wasn't a hero. He was a commodity, a piece of human livestock trained to die beautifully for the amusement of an empire. Let's start with how you became a gladiator, because contrary to popular belief, most didn't volunteer. Oh, some did. Desperate men, usually. Men so deep in debt that slavery seemed preferable to whatever fate awaited them in the streets. But the vast majority were dragged into the arena against their will. Picture this. You're a Celtic warrior, proud, free, fighting to defend your village from Roman legions. You lose, your friends die, your family is sold into slavery. And you're marched in chains to Rome, where a man with calculating eyes examines your muscles, your height, your scars. He's not looking at you as a person. He's looking at you as potential entertainment, measuring your worth in how spectacular your death might be. Or perhaps you're a Roman citizen who made the wrong political enemies. A whispered word in the wrong ear, a scandal that needs covering up, and suddenly you find yourself condemned to the arena. The legal system that once protected you now feeds you to the beast, quite literally. Then there were the criminals, murderers, thieves, rebels against the state. We might think of prison as punishment today, but Romans had a different philosophy. Why warehouse criminals when you could make them useful? The arena was Rome's ultimate form of criminal justice, a place where society's unwanted could be disposed of while providing valuable entertainment to the masses. But here's what's truly chilling. Children could become gladiators too. Boys captured in wars, orphans with no one to protect them. Even Roman citizens sold into slavery to pay their parents' debts. These children would be trained from an early age, their entire lives shaped by the knowledge that they existed to die for Rome's pleasure. The training began immediately. You'd be taken to a gladiator school, a ludus, and if you think that sounds educational, think again. These weren't schools in any sense we'd recognize. They were prisons designed to forge human weapons. The most famous was the Ludus Magnus in Rome, connected to the Colosseum by an underground tunnel. Imagine walking through that tunnel, knowing it led directly to your death. Your new home was a cell, barely large enough to lie down in. Stone walls, iron bars, a straw mattress that crawled with vermin. No privacy, no comfort, no hope of escape. The walls were thick, the guards were brutal, and suicide was surprisingly difficult when you were watched constantly and kept too weak to effectively harm yourself. The food was deliberately calculated. Gladiators were fed a diet heavy in barley, beans, and dried fruit. Historians call it gladiator gruel, and it served a specific purpose. It wasn't nutrition they cared about. It was building a layer of fat beneath the skin. You see, a gladiator with subcutaneous fat would bleed more spectacularly when cut, but the wounds would be less likely to be immediately fatal. The crowd wanted to see blood, but they also wanted the show to last. Compare this to modern fighters. A UFC athlete chooses their sport. They train in state-of-the-art facilities, work with nutritionists, have access to the best medical care. They fight for money, for glory, for the love of competition. They go home to their families after each fight. A gladiator had none of these luxuries. He fought because he had no choice, trained in a prison, and knew that each contest might be his last. The training itself was relentless and brutal. You'd wake before dawn to the sound of whips cracking and trainers shouting. Your day would begin with exercises designed to build strength and endurance, but also to break your spirit. You'd learn to use various weapons: the gladius, the trident, the net, the shield. Each weapon came with its own fighting style, its own rules, its own way of dying. The trainers were often former gladiators themselves, men who had somehow survived long enough to retire. They knew every trick, every weakness, every way to exploit an opponent's fear. But they also knew something else. Most of their students would be dead within a year. There was no point in forming attachments. You were teaching cattle how to be slaughtered more efficiently. Medical care existed, but it was purely practical. Gladiators were expensive to train and maintain. If you could be patched up and sent back to fight again, you would be. Roman doctors became surprisingly skilled at treating sword wounds, broken bones, and other combat injuries. But don't mistake this for compassion. You were being maintained like a racehorse, kept functional just long enough to provide entertainment. The psychological toll was devastating. Imagine knowing that your life had no value beyond your ability to kill or be killed for the amusement of others. Imagine forming friendships with fellow gladiators, only to watch them die in the arena, sometimes by your own hand. Imagine the constant fear, the knowledge that tomorrow might bring your death, and there was nothing you could do to prevent it. Some gladiators went mad. They'd be found in their cells, rocking back and forth, unable to eat or sleep. Others became coldly efficient killers, shutting down their emotions entirely to survive. A few found religion, praying to whatever gods might listen, though the gods seemed notably absent from the arena floor. Sleep was elusive. When you did manage to drift off, you'd often wake screaming from nightmares of the arena. The sound of the crowd, the feeling of sand beneath your feet, the smell of blood and sweat and fear. These memories would haunt you whether you were awake or asleep. The social hierarchy within the gladiator schools was complex and brutal. New arrivals were hazed mercilessly. Veterans who had survived multiple fights held a kind of grim respect, but they also knew their time was limited. Everyone was expendable, but some were more expendable than others. There were different types of gladiators, each with their own equipment and fighting style. The retiarius fought with a net and trident, relying on speed and agility. The secutor carried a heavy shield and sword, built for close combat. The Demacarus fought with 2 swords, a spectacular but often short-lived style. Each type had its own training regimen, its own techniques, its own way of meeting death. The weapons themselves were designed for spectacle as much as efficiency. A gladiator's sword was shorter than a legionnaire's, meant for close-quarters combat, where the crowd could see every thrust and parry. The net of a retiarius was weighted at the edges, difficult to escape from once entangled. The trident had 3 prongs, creating more dramatic wounds than a single spear point. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of gladiator training was the way it forced men to become complicit in their own oppression. You were taught to take pride in your skills, to want to win, to develop a competitive spirit. This wasn't kindness, it was manipulation. A gladiator who wanted to win would fight harder, would give the crowd a better show, would be more likely to kill his opponent efficiently rather than hesitate from moral qualms. The training also included lessons in showmanship. You learned to play to the crowd, to acknowledge their cheers, to make your death dramatic if defeat was inevitable. A gladiator who died well, who showed courage in his final moments, might be remembered fondly by the audience. His death might even be considered honorable. But it was still death, still the end of a life that had never truly been his own. Modern athletes train for victory. They study their opponents, develop strategies, push their bodies to peak performance. But they do it by choice, for their own goals, with the knowledge that they can walk away at any time. A gladiator trained for survival, knowing that his opponent was just another man in the same impossible situation, and that tomorrow they might be friends, or one of them might be dead. The lanista, the owner of the gladiator school, was a businessman first and foremost. He calculated the costs of training, feeding and housing gladiators against the profits from hiring them out for games. If a gladiator showed promise, he might receive slightly better treatment, better food, perhaps even a small cell of his own. But this wasn't mercy, it was investment protection. Some gladiators were allowed to marry, though their wives were often slaves as well. Children born to gladiators were automatically enslaved, destined to follow their fathers into the arena unless they could somehow buy their freedom. Family life, such as it was, existed under the constant shadow of death and separation. The psychological pressure was perhaps worst for those who had once been free. A Celtic chieftain who had led warriors into battle now found himself learning to die for Roman entertainment. A Greek philosopher who had once debated in the agora now practiced sword forms in a prison courtyard. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, yet somehow some gladiators managed to find meaning in their circumstances. They formed bonds with their fellow fighters, created a kind of brotherhood forged in shared suffering. They took pride in their skills, even knowing those skills were meant to end in death. They found small rebellions, tiny acts of defiance that helped them maintain some sense of self. The most famous gladiator rebellion, led by Spartacus, began in a gladiator school. These men who had been trained to fight for Rome's entertainment turned their skills against their oppressors. For a brief, shining moment, they were warriors again instead of slaves. Of course, it ended as all slave rebellions did, with mass crucifixions and a reminder that some forms of entertainment were not meant to be escaped. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand the full horror of what awaited these men in the arena, we need to understand the world that created them, the society that could watch human beings die for sport and call it civilization. We need to understand how Rome, the great empire that gave us law and literature and engineering marvels, could also give us the spectacle of human slaughter as public entertainment, because the gladiator was not an aberration in Roman society. He was its logical conclusion, the ultimate expression of an empire built on conquest and slavery, where human life was valued only in terms of its utility to the state. The man who entered the arena was already dead in every way that mattered. The sand would simply make it official. So rest now, dear listener. Let the weight of this knowledge settle gently into your thoughts. Tomorrow we'll walk deeper into this world of blood and sand, but tonight, simply remember that behind every cheer in the Colosseum was a man who had never chosen to be there, who fought not for glory, but for one more day of life, who died so that others might be entertained. The arena awaits, but for now, sleep comes first. Close your eyes and let the modern world return slowly, gratefully. You are safe in your bed, free to choose your dreams, free to wake tomorrow to a world where death is not entertainment and where your life belongs to you alone. The morning horn would pierce the darkness of the gladiator barracks like a blade through flesh. No gentle awakening here, no gradual transition from dreams to reality. One moment you were perhaps dreaming of home, of freedom, of a life that once belonged to you. The next, you were yanked into the harsh reality of your existence by the sound that meant another day of training, another day closer to death. Picture it, dozens of men, crammed into cells barely large enough for a grown man to stretch out fully, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, fear sweat, and the lingering stench of infected wounds that never quite healed properly. Some men would be weeping quietly, others staring at the stone walls with the hollow eyes of those who had already died inside. A few might be exercising, desperate to maintain some sense of control over their fate through physical preparation. The guards who came to rouse you weren't there to coddle. These were hard men, often former gladiators themselves, who had survived long enough to earn this slightly less deadly position. They carried whips and clubs, and they used them liberally. A gladiator who moved too slowly, who showed defiance, or who simply had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time would feel the sting of leather or the crack of wood against his skull. Aye, you'd stumble out into the training yard, squinting against the early morning sun that seemed almost mockingly bright after the perpetual gloom of your cell. The sand beneath your feet was the same sand that covered the arena floors, imported specifically to absorb blood efficiently. Even in training, you were being conditioned for death. The first meal of the day was a cruel joke, watery gruel, stale bread, perhaps some rancid meat, if you were lucky. But here's the twisted part. You were grateful for it. When you're constantly on the edge of starvation, any food becomes precious. The trainers knew this. They used hunger as another tool of control, another way to break down your resistance and rebuild you as a weapon. Modern athletes worry about their macronutrient ratios, their hydration levels, their recovery protocols. They have teams of experts optimizing every aspect of their nutrition to maximize performance. A gladiator got enough food to keep him upright and fighting, nothing more. The goal wasn't peak performance, it was acceptable spectacle. The training began immediately after this mockery of breakfast. You'd be handed wooden practice weapons, blunted but still capable of causing serious injury. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. You were being taught to fight with fake weapons so that you could later die with real ones. The doctors, the trainers, were artists in their own horrific way. They understood that a gladiator who died too quickly was worthless, but one who fought too defensively was boring. They needed to create fighters who would engage aggressively, who would take risks, who would give the crowd the blood and drama they craved. This required a delicate balance of skill, desperation, and broken spirits. You'd spend hours practicing basic movements, thrust, parry, block, dodge, over and over until your muscles screamed and your hands bled through the leather wrappings. But unlike a martial arts student today, you weren't learning these techniques to defend yourself or to compete fairly. You were learning them to kill other men who had no more choice in the matter than you did. The psychological warfare was constant and deliberate. Trainers would pit friends against each other in practice, forcing them to hurt men they'd grown to care about. They'd tell you stories about other gladiators who had tried to escape, describing their captures and executions in graphic detail. They'd remind you daily that your life belonged to Rome, that you existed only to serve the empire's appetite for blood. Some gladiators tried to maintain their humanity through small acts of kindness, sharing food with a weaker fighter, helping someone tend their wounds, offering comfort to a man facing his first battle. But even these gestures were corrupted by the system. Today's friend might be tomorrow's opponent. The man you helped survive his injuries might be the one who kills you in the arena. The medical attention gladiators received was purely utilitarian. Roman doctors became skilled at treating combat wounds, but only because wounded gladiators represented lost investments. If you could be patched up and sent back to fight again, you would be. If your injuries were too severe, if you become more expensive to maintain than you were worth, you might simply be left to die or killed outright. Think about that for a moment. In our modern world, we have entire medical specialties devoted to sports medicine, to keeping athletes healthy and competitive. We have physical therapists, nutritionists, psychologists, all working to optimize human performance and well-being. A gladiator had access to a doctor who could stitch up sword cuts and set broken bones, but only if doing so served the financial interests of his owner. The weapons training was elaborate and varied. Different types of gladiators used different equipment, each designed to create specific types of combat and spectacle. The retiarius, armed with a net and trident, represented the fisherman. The secutor, with his heavy shield and sword, was the pursuer. The thraex fought with a curved sword and small shield, quick and deadly. Each style had its own techniques, its own strategies, its own ways of killing and being killed. But here's what made it truly horrific. These weren't just fighting styles, they were theatrical roles. Each type of gladiator was a character in Rome's bloody drama, complete with specific armor, weapons, and expected behaviors. The crowd knew what to expect from each type, and gladiators were trained not just to fight, but to perform their roles convincingly. The retiarius was supposed to be agile and clever, dancing around his opponent while trying to entangle him in the net. The secutor was the relentless pursuer, advancing steadily behind his large shield. The dimiceros, fighting with two swords, was expected to be spectacular and aggressive, even though this fighting style was almost suicidal against heavily armored opponents. Imagine being forced to play a role in your own death. Modern actors choose their parts, develop their characters, find meaning in their performances. A gladiator was assigned a fighting style based on his body type and the needs of the games, then trained to embody that character until his death. He had no creative input, no choice in how his story would end. The training extended beyond just weapons work. Gladiators were taught to read the crowd, to understand what the audience wanted. A skilled gladiator could prolong his life by giving the spectators what they craved: drama, courage, spectacular violence. He learned to acknowledge the crowd's cheers, to make his victories look effortless, to die with dignity if defeat was inevitable. This crowd management was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of gladiator training. You were being taught to collaborate in your own objectification, to become complicit in the system that would ultimately destroy you. The better you became at entertaining the crowd, the more likely you were to survive individual fights, but also the more valuable you became as a commodity. The social dynamics within gladiator schools were complex and brutal. New arrivals were hazed mercilessly, not just by guards but by veteran gladiators who saw fresh meat as a threat to their own precarious positions. Veterans who had survived multiple fights commanded a kind of respect, but they also knew their time was limited. Everyone was expendable, but some were more expendable than others. Friendships formed despite the system's attempts to prevent them. Men facing death together found ways to connect, to maintain some semblance of humanity in an inhuman situation. They'd share stories of their former lives, their families, their hopes for an afterlife where they might find peace. These bonds were both a source of strength and a vulnerability that the system ruthlessly exploited. The sleeping arrangements were deliberately designed to break down privacy and personal space. Multiple gladiators crammed into small cells, unable to escape each other's presence, forced to witness each other's breakdowns and fears. Some men would lie awake all night, staring at the ceiling, trying to process the reality of their situation. Others would weep quietly, hoping their cellmates wouldn't hear and use their vulnerability against them. The constant threat of violence wasn't limited to the arena. Gladiator schools were brutal places where the strong preyed on the weak, where guards settled disputes with whips and clubs, where even minor infractions could result in severe punishment. A gladiator who showed defiance might be beaten unconscious, starved for days, or forced to fight additional matches as punishment. Yet somehow, in this environment of systematic dehumanization, some men found ways to maintain their dignity. They'd secretly practice religious rituals, maintaining connection to their gods and their cultural identities. They'd create art with whatever materials they could find, carving images into stone walls or creating small sculptures from scraps. They'd compose songs or poems, keeping alive the parts of themselves that the system couldn't touch. The training regime was designed to create specific types of fighters for specific types of entertainment. Some gladiators were trained to fight wild animals, a different skill set entirely from human combat. These bestiarii needed to understand animal behavior, to know how to provoke a lion or bear into attacking, how to dodge and weave, and ultimately kill creatures that were often stronger and faster than they were. Others were trained for naval battles, the naumachii, where the arena would be flooded and gladiators would fight from ships. These men needed to learn seamanship as well as combat, to understand how to fight while managing a vessel, how to ram enemy ships and board them for hand-to-hand combat. All of this training was for the amusement of spectators who had never faced such dangers themselves. The psychological preparation was perhaps the most insidious aspect of gladiator training. Trainers worked to break down the men's natural reluctance to kill, to overcome the human instinct for self-preservation that might make them hesitate in combat. They used a combination of brutalization, conditioning, and manipulation to create killers who would perform on command. Some gladiators were given drugs before fights, substances that would dull pain and increase aggression. Others were deliberately provoked with insults about their families, their homelands, their masculine honor. The goal was to create fighters who would engage fully in combat, who would give the crowd the spectacle they demanded rather than simply trying to survive. The economic realities of gladiator training were harsh and calculating. A lanista, the owner of a gladiator school, was essentially running a business that produced human entertainment. He calculated the costs of acquisition, training, feeding, and housing gladiators against the profits from hiring them out for games. If a gladiator showed promise, he might receive slightly better treatment, but this was investment protection, not compassion. Successful gladiators could earn money for their owners, and sometimes even small payments for themselves. But this created another layer of psychological torture, the promise of eventual freedom through victory. Some gladiators were told that if they won enough fights, if they survived long enough, they might earn their freedom. This hope was often false, a carrot dangled to keep men fighting when they might otherwise give up. The rudis, the wooden sword given to gladiators upon retirement, was a symbol of freedom that few ever received. Most gladiators died in the arena long before they could earn their release. Those who did survive often found that freedom was hollow after years of conditioning and trauma. They had been shaped by violence, defined by it, and many struggled to find meaning in a world that no longer revolved around death and combat. As you lie there now, comfortable in your bed, free to choose your dreams, consider the men who never had that luxury. Tomorrow we'll walk with them into the arena itself, where all this training and brutalization would culminate in spectacle and death. But tonight, rest easy in the knowledge that your life belongs to you, that your sleep is your own, and that the morning will bring choices rather than commands. The sand grows quiet now, the training weapons rest, and even the most brutal system needs its rest. Close your eyes and let the weight of this history settle gently into your thoughts. You are safe here, free here, human here, in ways that those ancient fighters never were. The arena itself was a marvel of Roman engineering, but not the kind that inspires awe. It was a machine designed for death, every detail calculated to maximize the spectacle of human suffering. The Colosseum could hold 80,000 spectators, and every seat had a clear view of the killing floor. The acoustics were perfect, ensuring that every scream, every clash of steel, every death rattle would reach the ears of the crowd. Modern stadiums are designed for safety, comfort, and fair competition. Emergency exits are clearly marked, medical facilities are on standby, and the playing surface is carefully maintained to prevent injury. The Colosseum was designed for the opposite purpose, to trap men in a space where death was not just possible, but inevitable, where the only escape was through victory or the grave. The hypodium, the underground network beneath the arena floor, was a labyrinth of tunnels, chambers, and mechanical devices. Here, gladiators waited in holding cells, listening to the roar of the crowd above, knowing that soon they would be lifted by primitive elevators into the sunlight to die. The sound of those mechanisms, the grinding of gears and pulleys, became associated with impending death for every man who heard it. Think about the psychology of that moment. You're crammed into a cage barely large enough to stand in, surrounded by other men who are just as terrified as you are. Some are praying to gods who seem to have abandoned them. Others are vomiting from fear or practicing their sword forms one last time. The noise from above is deafening, a constant reminder that your death is entertainment for people who will go home to warm beds and loving families. The elevator ride to the surface was perhaps the most terrifying part of the entire experience. You'd feel the platform lurching upward, carrying you from the familiar darkness of the underground into the blinding light of the arena. The crowd's roar would grow louder with each foot of ascent, until finally you'd emerge into a world of sand and sun and screaming voices. Modern fighters walk to their matches through corridors lined with fans and media. They have entrance music, pyrotechnics, announcers building up their accomplishments. A gladiator emerged from the ground like a piece of stage machinery, already less than human in the eyes of the audience. He was a prop in someone else's entertainment, not a person with hopes and fears and people who loved him. The sand beneath your feet was imported from Egypt, chosen specifically for its ability to absorb blood without becoming slippery. The Romans had tested different materials, different textures, all to find the perfect surface for men to die on. Even this detail, seemingly minor, revealed the cold calculation behind the spectacle. Nothing was left to chance except the gladiators' lives. The crowd was a living thing, a beast with 80,000 voices that could shift from cheering to bloodthirsty howling in an instant. They had favourites, men they'd seen fight before and somehow survive. They had betting pools, complicated wagers on who would live and who would die. They brought cushions and wine and snacks, settling in to watch human beings slaughter each other as if it were a day at the races. Compare this to modern sports audiences. Yes, they get passionate, they cheer and boo, and sometimes even fight each other. But they're watching athletes compete, not die. They're invested in the outcome of a game, not the literal survival of the participants. The Roman crowd was there to see death, and they were disappointed if they didn't get it. The editor, the man who sponsored the games, sat in the place of honour, surrounded by other wealthy citizens and visiting dignitaries. He was the one who would decide whether a defeated gladiator lived or died, responding to the crowd's wishes, but ultimately making the call himself. This man, who had never held a sword in anger, who had never felt the sand of the arena beneath his feet, held the power of life and death over men who had spent years preparing for this moment. The thumbs up or thumbs down gesture, made famous by Hollywood, is actually a historical debate. Some scholars believe the crowd and editor used different hand signals entirely, but the reality remains, a gesture from the stands could end a man's life or grant him a temporary reprieve. Your fate was literally in the hands of people who saw you as entertainment, not as a human being. The weapons you carried into the arena were real, sharpened to deadly perfection. After months of training with wooden swords and blunted spears, the weight and balance of actual steel felt strange in your hands. These weren't the standardized weapons of the Roman legions, designed for efficiency and uniformity. These were theatrical props, ornate and varied, each type designed to create specific visual effects when they drew blood. The armor was equally theatrical. A retiarius wore almost nothing, his bare chest and limbs exposed to both weapons and the crowd's gaze. A secutor was encased in heavy bronze and leather, his vision limited by a helmet with narrow eye slits. A thraex wore elaborate leg guards and arm protection, his armor decorated with images of gods and mythical creatures. All of it was designed to enhance the spectacle, not to protect the wearer. The referee, the summa rudis, was another former gladiator, who had somehow survived long enough to earn this position. He carried a wooden staff and tried to ensure that the fights followed certain rules, but his primary job was to keep the action moving and prevent the gladiators from simply defending themselves without attacking. A boring fight was a failed fight, regardless of who survived. The moment of truth came when the gates opened and you walked into the arena proper. The sound hit you like a physical blow. 80,000 voices rising in anticipation. The sun was blinding after the darkness of the holding cells. Your legs felt unsteady, whether from fear or the effects of whatever drugs they'd given you to make you more aggressive. Your opponent emerged from the opposite side of the arena, and for a moment you might look at each other across the sand. He was just another man, probably as terrified as you were. Definitely as trapped in this system as you were. Maybe you'd trained together, shared meals, even considered each other friends. Now one of you was going to die for the entertainment of people who didn't even know your names. The fight itself was both the culmination of all your training and a complete departure from it. Training had been controlled, structured, with rules and safety measures. The arena was chaos. The crowd's noise was disorienting, the sun was blinding, and the knowledge that this was life or death changed everything. Techniques. You'd practiced hundreds of times felt clumsy and unfamiliar when performed with shaking hands and a racing heart. Modern fighters train for years to develop muscle memory, to react instinctively under pressure. But they're fighting for victory, for money, for personal achievement. They're not fighting for their lives against someone who has no choice but to try to kill them. The psychological pressure was beyond anything we can imagine today. The crowd's reaction influenced everything. They cheered for aggressive attacks, booed defensive fighting, and screamed for blood when a gladiator was wounded. Their bloodlust was palpable, a living force that pushed fighters to take risks they might not otherwise take. A gladiator who played too defensively might find himself facing fresh opponents until he either became more aggressive or died trying. The injuries were catastrophic and immediate. A sword thrust to the chest, a spear through the abdomen, a net dragging a man down while a trident found his throat. These weren't the controlled, minimal injuries of modern combat sports. These were wounds designed to kill, and they usually succeeded. The sand soaked up the blood so efficiently that within minutes, all evidence of a man's death would be absorbed into the earth. But sometimes, rarely, a gladiator would survive. He might defeat his opponent through skill, luck, or simple desperation. The crowd would cheer, the editor would nod approvingly, and the victor would be allowed to live another day. But this victory was hollow, temporary. It only meant that tomorrow, or next week, or next month, he would be back in the arena facing another opponent, another chance to die. The psychological toll of killing another human being was devastating. Even when survival depended on it, even when the opponent was trying to kill you, taking a life left scars that never healed. Some gladiators became cold, efficient killers, shutting down their emotions entirely. Others were consumed by guilt and shame. haunted by the faces of the men they'd killed. All of them were changed by the experience in ways that made normal life impossible. The victorious gladiator would receive a palm branch, a symbol of triumph that felt obscene given the circumstances. He might also receive money, gifts from admiring spectators, or promises of better treatment. But these rewards were meaningless compared to what he'd lost: his humanity, his peace of mind, his ability to exist in the world without the constant weight of death on his shoulders. The defeated gladiator faced a different kind of horror. If he was wounded but not dead, he would lie in the sand while the crowd decided his fate. Some might call for mercy, especially if he had fought bravely. Others would demand his death, their thumbs turned down in the gesture that sealed his doom. The final moments of his life would be spent listening to strangers debate whether he deserved to live or die. The gladiator who received mercy didn't escape death, only postponed it. He would be carried from the arena, his wounds tended just enough to keep him alive for future fights. The medical care was utilitarian, focused on getting him back into fighting condition as quickly as possible. There was no concern for his long-term health or well-being, only for his value as entertainment. The bodies of the dead were dragged from the arena by slaves dressed as Charon, the ferryman of the underworld, and other mythological figures. This theatrical touch turned even death into part of the show. The corpses were stripped of their armor and weapons, then disposed of in mass graves outside the city. No monuments marked their passing. No poems celebrated their lives. They had died as they had lived in the arena, as anonymous entertainment. The sand was raked smooth after each fight, erasing all evidence of what had transpired. Fresh sand was spread over the blood-soaked earth, and the arena was ready for the next pair of gladiators. The crowd never had to confront the reality of what they were watching, never had to see the lasting consequences of their entertainment. Between fights, the crowd was entertained by musicians, acrobats, and other performers. They ate and drank and socialized, treating the interval between deaths as they might treat intermission at a theatre. The casual nature of their enjoyment made the spectacle even more horrifying. Death had become so normalized, so routine, that it was just another part of a pleasant afternoon out. The games could last for days, with hundreds of gladiators dying for the crowd's amusement. Some were elaborate productions with themes and narratives, mock battles that recreated famous historical events. Others were simple executions, condemned criminals thrown to wild animals or forced to fight trained gladiators with inferior weapons. All of it was designed to satisfy Rome's insatiable appetite for blood and death. The gladiators who survived the day would be taken back to the underground chambers, their wounds tended, their bodies cleaned of blood and sand. They would eat their gruel and return to their cells, knowing that they had bought themselves a little more time, but changed nothing about their fundamental situation. Tomorrow might bring another fight, another chance to die, another opportunity to kill someone who didn't deserve to die. The psychological scars accumulated with each survival. Every gladiator who lived through multiple fights carried the weight of the men he'd killed, the friends he'd lost, the crowd's bloodthirsty cheers that had accompanied each death. Sleep brought nightmares, waking hours brought anxiety, and the future held only more of the same, until death finally claimed them. Some gladiators achieved a kind of fame, becoming celebrities whose names were known throughout the empire. But this fame was based on their ability to kill other human beings entertainingly, not on any genuine achievement or virtue. They were famous for being successful killers, and their celebrity status only made their situation more tragic. The gladiator schools became breeding grounds for rebellion, places where men with nothing left to lose could find others in similar circumstances. The most famous revolt, led by Spartacus, began in a gladiator school and spread across much of Italy. But even this uprising, heroic as it was, ended in mass crucifixion and a reminder that the system would not tolerate resistance. The arena was more than just a place of death. It was a symbol of everything that was wrong with Roman society. It represented the empire's casual brutality, its dehumanization of conquered peoples, its transformation of human suffering into entertainment. It was the logical endpoint of a civilization that valued spectacle over humanity, power over justice, and entertainment over empathy. As you rest now in your safe, warm bed, think about those men who never had such comfort. They lived and died in a world where human life was cheap, where death was entertainment, and where the only escape from suffering was through more suffering. Their stories remind us of the depths to which human civilization can sink when we lose sight of our common humanity. The sand has been raked smooth, the bodies carried away, and the crowd has gone home to their comfortable lives. But the echoes of their suffering remain, a reminder of what happens when we treat other human beings as objects for our amusement. Sleep well, knowing that you live in a world where such spectacles are history, not reality, and where human life has more value than the price of admission to watch someone die. The arena may have been where gladiators met their fate, but their suffering didn't end with death. In our modern world, when an athlete dies, we memorialize them. We build statues, retire their numbers, create foundations in their names. We remember them as human beings who achieved something meaningful. But a gladiator's death was designed to be forgotten as quickly as possible. The moment a gladiator fell, slaves dressed as Mercury and Charon would rush onto the sand. Mercury would touch the body with his heated caduceus, testing for signs of life. If the gladiator was truly dead, Charon would strike the corpse with his hammer, a ritualistic claiming of the soul for the underworld. This theatrical display turned even death into performance art, stripping away the last shreds of human dignity from men who had already been robbed of everything else. The bodies were dragged away by hooks, their armor and weapons collected for reuse. Think about that for a moment. Modern sports equipment is often retired when an athlete dies wearing it, treated with reverence as a memorial. But gladiator gear was simply recycled, passed on to the next man who would die in it. The blood was washed off, the dents hammered out, and the armor was ready for another death. The corpses were taken to the spoliarium, a room beneath the arena where the dead were stripped of any remaining valuables. Wedding rings, good luck charms, tattoos that might be cut away and sold to collectors who prize such macabre souvenirs. The human body became a commodity even in death, every part of it potentially valuable to someone. Most gladiators were buried in mass graves outside Rome, their bodies thrown into pits like refuse. No headstones marked their passing. No family members mourned at their graves. They had died as they had lived in the arena, anonymously, valueless, except for the entertainment they provided. Archaeological excavations have uncovered these burial sites, revealing the broken bones and sword cuts that tell the story of lives ended for sport. Compare this to how we treat our modern athletes. When a boxer dies from injuries sustained in the ring, there are investigations, rule changes, medical reviews. The death is treated as a tragedy, something to be prevented in the future. When a gladiator died, it was simply Tuesday. The show went on, the crowd went home, and another man was trained to take his place. The few gladiators who achieved fame faced a different kind of horror. Their names might be remembered, painted on walls by fans or carved into pottery. But this fame was built on their ability to kill other human beings entertainingly. They were celebrities of death, their popularity measured in the number of men they'd slaughtered for public amusement. Imagine being famous for murder. In our world, we celebrate athletes for their skill, their dedication, their achievements. We make them role models for children, ambassadors for their sports. A famous gladiator was celebrated for being an efficient killer, and children would play games imitating their fighting styles. The moral corruption was complete and systemic. The gladiator's diet, that carefully calculated mixture of barley gruel and beans, wasn't just about creating visual spectacle. It was about control. about maintaining the precise balance between strength and vulnerability that made for good entertainment. Modern athletes work with nutritionists to optimize their performance, to give them every possible advantage. Gladiators were fed to make their deaths more entertaining. The medical care available to gladiators reveals the same twisted priorities. Roman doctors became skilled at treating sword wounds, not to save lives, but to preserve investments. A gladiator who could be patched up and sent back to fight again was worth more than one who died immediately. The famous gladiator physician Galen learned much of his anatomy from treating arena injuries, advancing medical knowledge on the backs of men who had no choice but to suffer for science. But here's what makes the gladiators' situation even more psychologically devastating. Many of them were skilled fighters, intelligent men who understood tactics and strategy. They knew they were capable of so much more than dying for entertainment. A Celtic chieftain who had once led armies was reduced to learning choreographed death scenes. A Germanic warrior who had defended his homeland was taught to play a character in Rome's deadly theatre. The lanista, the gladiator school owner, was running what we might recognize today as a particularly brutal form of human trafficking. He bought, sold, and traded human beings like livestock, calculating their value based on their ability to die spectacularly. Some lanistae became wealthy from this trade, respected businessmen who provided an essential service to Roman society. They were entrepreneurs of death, and the empire rewarded them for it. The betting that surrounded gladiator games was extensive and complex. Romans would wager on everything: which gladiator would win, how long the fight would last, whether the crowd would spare a defeated fighter. Imagine being reduced to statistics in someone else's gambling addiction. Modern sports betting is controversial enough when it involves willing participants competing for money. Roman betting was literally gambling on human lives. The sexual exploitation of gladiators adds another layer of horror to their story. Some wealthy Roman women would pay for private encounters with famous gladiators, seeing them as exotic and dangerous lovers. These men, already stripped of their freedom and dignity, were further reduced to sexual objects. They had no right to refuse, no agency over their own bodies. Even their sexuality belonged to their owners. The gladiator schools themselves were prisons designed to break the human spirit. The cells were deliberately cramped and uncomfortable, the food insufficient, the punishment severe. But perhaps worst of all was the psychological manipulation. Trainers would tell gladiators they were lucky to be there, that they were honored to die for Rome's entertainment. This gaslighting was designed to make men complicit in their own destruction. Some gladiators did achieve freedom through the rudes, the wooden sword given to retired fighters. But consider what this freedom meant. These men had been trained for years to kill, had their personalities shaped by violence and death. They had no marketable skills outside of combat, no social connections beyond the arena. Many struggled to adapt to civilian life, haunted by the men they'd killed and the friends they'd lost. The psychological profile of a gladiator would be recognized today as severe PTSD. They suffered from nightmares, hypervigilance, survivor's guilt, and social isolation. But Roman society had no understanding of mental health, no treatment for psychological trauma. These men were expected to simply endure their suffering in silence, to be grateful for the opportunity to die for entertainment. The crowd's behavior reveals something deeply disturbing about human nature. These weren't barbarians or primitives. They were citizens of one of history's most advanced civilizations. They had literature, philosophy, engineering marvels, yet they could sit in comfortable seats, eating snacks and cheering while human beings were butchered in front of them. The normalization of violence was so complete that even children attended the games. The gladiator's equipment was a study in cruel irony. The net of the retiarius was designed to entangle his opponent, but it also served as a metaphor for the gladiator's own situation. He was trapped, unable to escape his fate. struggling against bonds that only grew tighter with each attempt to break free. The trident he carried was a symbol of Neptune, god of the sea. But for the gladiator, it was simply another tool of death. The different types of gladiators represented different forms of death, different ways of dying for the crowd's amusement. The heavily armoured secutor would die slowly, his vision limited by his helmet, his movements slowed by his equipment. The lightly armed retiarius would die quickly, his exposed flesh easy prey for his opponent's weapons. Each fighting style was optimized for spectacle, not survival. The training regimen was designed to create muscle memory for killing, to make violence instinctive and automatic. Modern athletes train to perfect their techniques, to achieve personal bests, to compete at the highest levels. Gladiators train to make their deaths entertaining, to kill other human beings efficiently, to perform violence as art. The gladiator's relationship with the crowd was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of his existence. He was forced to acknowledge their cheers, to play to their desires, to make them complicit in his death. The crowd's approval meant another day of life, but it also meant another day of being a performing animal in Rome's human zoo. The seasonal nature of the games meant that gladiators lived in constant uncertainty. They might go months without fighting, their anxiety building as they waited for their name to be called. Or they might fight multiple times in a single day, their survival becoming increasingly unlikely with each encounter. The unpredictability was part of the psychological torture. The gladiator's family, if he had one, suffered alongside him. Wives and children of gladiators lived in constant fear, knowing that any day might bring news of their loved one's death. They couldn't plan for the future, couldn't hope for a normal life. The gladiator's slavery extended its shadow over everyone who cared about him. The economic impact of gladiator games was enormous. Entire industries existed to support the spectacle. Weapon makers, armor crafters, animal trainers, sand suppliers. The death of human beings had become a cornerstone of Roman commerce, creating jobs and generating wealth from suffering. The empire's economy was literally built on blood. The gladiator's death was often the climax of elaborate theatrical productions. Some games featured hundreds of fighters in massive battle recreations, historical events restaged with real casualties. Others were more intimate, one-on-one encounters where the crowd could focus on individual suffering. All of it was designed to maximize the emotional impact of watching human beings die. The aftermath of the games saw the arena cleaned and prepared for the next spectacle. The sand was raked smooth, the blood washed away, the bodies removed. Within hours, all evidence of the day's carnage was gone, erased as if it had never happened. The normalization of violence was so complete that death left no lasting mark on the place where it occurred. The gladiator's story is ultimately one of dehumanization, of a system that reduced human beings to their entertainment value. These men were not criminals or volunteers. They were slaves, prisoners of war, and condemned men forced to die for the amusement of others. Their suffering was not incidental to their purpose. It was the entire point. As you rest now in your comfortable bed, free to choose your dreams and wake to a world where your life belongs to you, remember the men who never had such luxury. They lived and died in a system that saw them as expendable, that valued their deaths more than their lives, that turned human suffering into public entertainment. The sand has been raked smooth, the crowds have gone home, and the arena stands empty, but the echoes of their suffering remain, a reminder of what happens when we lose sight of our common humanity. Sleep well, knowing that you live in a world where such spectacles are history, not reality, and where human dignity is not just a privilege, but a right. Tomorrow we'll explore how some of these men found ways to resist, to maintain their humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. But tonight, let their memory rest, and let yours be peaceful. The gladiators' long battle is over, but their story continues to teach us about the value of human life and the dangers of treating others as objects for our entertainment. The gladiator who somehow managed to survive multiple fights faced a psychological hell that modern combat sports can barely comprehend. Today's UFC fighters deal with pressure, yes, but they also have sports psychologists, support teams, and the knowledge that a loss means disappointment, not death. A veteran gladiator carried the weight of every man he'd killed, every friend he'd watched die, every crowd that had cheered for blood. Sleep became impossible. The veteran gladiator would lie in his cell, staring at stone walls that seemed to close in tighter each night. His hands would shake uncontrollably, muscle memory from the arena manifesting in tremors he couldn't control. The faces of the men he'd killed would visit him in dreams, asking why he had survived when they had not. There was no answer to give them, no justification that made sense. The bonds between gladiators were forged in shared suffering, but they were also poisoned by the knowledge that friendship was a luxury they couldn't afford. You might eat meals with a man, share stories of home, even come to care about his welfare. But the next day, you might face him across the sand, and one of you would have to die. The system was designed to corrupt even the most basic human connections. Some gladiators tried to maintain their sanity through ritual. They would pray to their ancestral gods, perform ceremonies from their homelands, create small shrines in their cells, using whatever materials they could find. These acts of defiance were tiny rebellions against a system that sought to erase their identities entirely. A Celtic warrior might carve symbols into his cell wall. A Germanic tribesman might sing songs from his childhood. A Greek philosopher might recite verses from Homer. But the guards were always watching, always ready to punish any sign of resistance. A gladiator caught practicing his native religion might be beaten, starved, or forced to fight additional matches. The system tolerated no expression of individual identity, no reminder that these men had once been free. The medical treatments available to gladiators were a grotesque parody of healing. Roman physicians developed sophisticated techniques for treating sword wounds, not out of compassion, but out of economic necessity. A gladiator who died from an infected cut was a wasted investment, so they learned to stitch flesh, set bones, and treat trauma with the same cold efficiency they might use on a valuable racehorse. The famous physician Galen, who would later become one of history's most influential medical writers, learned much of his anatomy from treating gladiator wounds. He would dissect the bodies of dead fighters, studying their organs and muscle structure to better understand human physiology. Even in death, gladiators served the empire's purposes, their corpses becoming teaching tools for future generations of doctors. Pain management was primitive and often counterproductive. Gladiators might be given wine mixed with herbs before fights, substances that dulled sensation but also slowed reflexes. Others were given stimulants that increased aggression but also made them more likely to take fatal risks. The goal was never the gladiator's well-being. It was always the quality of the entertainment. The social hierarchy within gladiator schools was complex and brutal. New arrivals were hazed mercilessly, not just by guards but by veteran fighters who saw fresh meat as a threat to their own precarious positions. Veterans who had survived multiple fights commanded a kind of respect, but they also knew their time was limited. The mortality rate was so high that even successful gladiators rarely lived more than a few years. The star system that developed around famous gladiators was particularly cruel. These men became celebrities, their names painted on walls, their likenesses carved into pottery. But their fame was built on their ability to kill other human beings entertainingly. They were famous for being successful murderers, and their celebrity status only made their situation more tragic. Marcus Attilius was one such celebrity gladiator, a free man who had volunteered for the arena to pay off debts. He defeated several veteran fighters in his early matches, becoming a crowd favourite. But fame in the arena was fleeting and deadly. Each victory only meant facing more dangerous opponents, each triumph bringing him closer to inevitable defeat. His story, like so many others, ended in blood and sand. The betting culture surrounding gladiator games was extensive and sophisticated. Romans would wager on everything: which gladiator would win, how long the fight would last, whether a defeated fighter would be spared by the crowd. Imagine being reduced to statistics in someone else's gambling addiction. Your life literally became a commodity to be bought, sold, and wagered upon. The sexual exploitation of gladiators added another layer of degradation to their already horrific existence. Some wealthy Roman women would pay for private encounters with famous gladiators, seeing them as exotic and dangerous lovers. These men, already stripped of their freedom and dignity, were further reduced to sexual objects. They had no right to refuse, no agency over their own bodies. Even their sexuality belonged to their owners. The gladiator schools operated like factories for producing human weapons. The lanista, the school owner, was essentially running a business that manufactured death. He calculated the costs of acquisition, training, feeding, and housing gladiators against the profits from renting them out for games. If a gladiator showed promise, he might receive slightly better treatment, but this was investment protection, not compassion. The training regimen was designed to break down natural human reluctance to kill. Gladiators were forced to practice on each other, to hurt men they lived alongside, to overcome their instinctive empathy. The trainers used a combination of brutalization, conditioning, and psychological manipulation to create killers who would perform on command. Some gladiators were drugged before fights, given substances that would increase aggression and dull pain. Others were deliberately provoked with insults about their families, their homelands, their masculine honor. The goal was to create fighters who would engage fully in combat, who would give the crowd the blood and drama they craved. The weapons themselves were works of art, ornate and deadly. Unlike the practical weapons of the Roman legions, gladiator equipment was designed for spectacle. Retiarius's trident was decorated with engravings. A Secuta's helmet bore elaborate crests. Athraex's sword was curved and polished to gleam in the sunlight. These beautiful instruments of death were crafted to enhance the visual impact of combat. The armor was equally theatrical. Some gladiators fought nearly naked, their bodies exposed to both weapons and the crowd's gaze. Others were encased in bronze and leather, their movements slowed by the weight of their protection. All of it was designed to create specific types of combat, specific visual effects when blood was spilled. The referee system in gladiator combat was rudimentary and biased. The summa rudis, usually a former gladiator who had survived long enough to earn the position, was supposed to ensure fair play. But his primary job was to keep the action moving, to prevent fighters from being too defensive, to ensure that the crowd got the blood they had paid to see. The crowd's behavior during gladiator games reveals something deeply disturbing about human nature. These weren't barbarians or primitives. They were citizens of one of history's most advanced civilizations. They had literature, philosophy, engineering marvels. Yet they could sit in comfortable seats, eating snacks and cheering, while human beings were butchered in front of them. Children attended these games, learning from an early age that human life was cheap, that violence was entertainment, that the suffering of others was acceptable if it was officially sanctioned. The normalization of brutality was so complete that killing became as routine as theatre, as casual as chariot racing. The economic impact of gladiator games was enormous. Entire industries existed to support the spectacle. Weapon makers, armor crafters, animal trainers, sand suppliers. The death of human beings had become a cornerstone of Roman commerce, creating jobs and generating wealth from suffering. Cities competed to host the most elaborate games, measuring their success by the number of gladiators killed. The gladiators' relationship with death was unlike anything in human experience. Modern soldiers fight for causes they believe in, with comrades they trust, for countries they love. A gladiator fought for the entertainment of strangers against men who were as much victims as he was, for an empire that saw him as expendable. The psychological profile of a gladiator would be recognized today as severe PTSD. They suffered from nightmares, hypervigilance, survivor's guilt, and social isolation. But Roman society had no understanding of mental health, no treatment for psychological trauma. These men were expected to simply endure their suffering in silence, to be grateful for the opportunity to die for entertainment. The few gladiators who achieved freedom through the rudis, the wooden sword given to retired fighters, faced a different kind of hell. They had been trained for years to kill, had their personalities shaped by violence and death. They had no marketable skills outside of combat, no social connections beyond the arena. Many struggled to adapt to civilian life, haunted by the men they'd killed and the friends they'd lost. Some former gladiators became trainers themselves, passing on their knowledge to the next generation of condemned men. Others tried to disappear into the general population, but their scars and fighting skills marked them as former arena fighters. A few achieved genuine success, using their fame to start businesses or gain political influence, but these were rare exceptions. The gladiator's family, if he had one, suffered alongside him. Wives and children of gladiators lived in constant fear, knowing that any day might bring news of their loved one's death. They couldn't plan for the future, couldn't hope for a normal life. The gladiator's slavery extended its shadow over everyone who cared about him. The seasonal nature of the games meant that gladiators lived in constant uncertainty. They might go months without fighting, their anxiety building as they waited for their name to be called. Or they might fight multiple times in a single day, their survival becoming increasingly unlikely with each encounter. The unpredictability was part of the psychological torture. The gladiator's death was often the climax of elaborate theatrical productions. Some games featured hundreds of fighters in massive battle recreations, historical events restaged with real casualties. Others were more intimate, one-on-one encounters where the crowd could focus on individual suffering. All of it was designed to maximize the emotional impact of watching human beings die. The aftermath of each fight saw the arena cleaned and prepared for the next spectacle. The sand was raked smooth, the blood washed away, the bodies removed. Within hours, all evidence of the day's carnage was gone, erased as if it had never happened. The normalization of violence was so complete that death left no lasting mark on the place where it occurred. The gladiator's equipment was recycled endlessly. The sword that killed one man would be cleaned and given to another. The armor that failed to protect one fighter would be repaired and worn by the next. Nothing was wasted except human life, which was the cheapest commodity in the empire. The religious aspects of gladiator combat were deeply cynical. The fights were held during religious festivals, supposedly honoring the gods. But what kind of deity would be pleased by the systematic murder of innocent men? The religious justification was a thin veneer over what was essentially ritualized murder for entertainment. The gladiator's story is ultimately one of dehumanization, of a system that reduced human beings to their entertainment value. These men were not criminals or volunteers. They were slaves, prisoners of war, and condemned men forced to die for the amusement of others. Their suffering was not incidental to their purpose. It was the entire point. As you rest now in your comfortable bed, free to choose your dreams and wake to a world where your life belongs to you, remember the men who never had such luxury. They lived and died in a system that saw them as expendable, that valued their deaths more than their lives, that turned human suffering into public entertainment. The sand has been raked smooth. The crowds have gone home and the arena stands empty, but the echoes of their suffering remain, a reminder of what happens when we lose sight of our common humanity. Sleep well, knowing that you live in a world where such spectacles are history, not reality, and where human dignity is not just a privilege, but a right. The gladiators' long battle is over, but their story continues to teach us about the value of human life and the dangers of treating others as objects for our entertainment. Rest now, and let their memory be a gentle reminder of how precious your freedom truly is. The arena might have been where gladiators met their fate, but the true horror lay in the systematic destruction of hope that preceded it. You see, hope is what keeps human beings alive even in the darkest circumstances. Modern prisoners of war survive brutal conditions by clinging to the possibility of rescue, of eventual freedom, of returning home. But the gladiator system was designed to methodically crush that hope, to replace it with a kind of desperate acceptance that made men complicit in their own destruction. Consider the promises that were dangled before these men like carrots, before starving donkeys. The lanista might tell a promising fighter that if he won enough battles, if he survived long enough, he could earn his freedom. The rudes, that wooden sword symbolizing retirement, was held up as the ultimate prize. But the mathematics of survival were deliberately impossible. Even the most skilled gladiator faced odds that made long-term survival virtually impossible. Let's put this in perspective. A modern UFC fighter might have a career spanning 10 to 15 years, with perhaps 30 to 40 fights. They train for specific opponents, they have time to recover between matches, and losing means disappointment, not death. A gladiator might face multiple opponents in a single day, with no time to recover, no opportunity to study his enemies, and defeat meant a sword through the heart while the crowd cheered. The few gladiators who did achieve fame and relative longevity found themselves trapped in a different kind of hell. Take someone like Flamma, a Syrian gladiator who fought 34 times and won 21 matches. He was offered the rudes 4 times and refused it each time. Why? Because he had been so completely broken by the system that he couldn't imagine existing outside of it. The arena had become his entire identity, his only source of meaning, his prison and his home. This psychological conditioning was no accident. The trainers understood that a gladiator who still believed in life beyond the arena might hesitate at crucial moments, might show mercy to an opponent, might not give the crowd the blood they craved. So they worked systematically to destroy any connection to the outside world, any hope of a different future. New gladiators were often told that their families were dead, their homelands destroyed, their former lives erased. Whether this was true or not mattered less than the psychological impact. A man who believed he had nothing left to lose would fight more desperately, more entertainingly. He would embrace his role as a human weapon because it was the only identity left to him. The sexual dynamics within gladiator schools added another layer of degradation. Young, attractive gladiators were often subject to rape by guards, other prisoners, or even wealthy visitors who paid for the privilege. These men had no recourse, no protection, no way to defend themselves without facing even worse punishment. Their bodies belonged to the system as completely as their lives did. Some gladiators were castrated, not as punishment, but as a form of crowd control. Eunuch gladiators were seen as exotic entertainment, their emasculation adding another dimension to their degradation. They fought knowing they had been robbed not just of their freedom, but of their very manhood, their ability to father children, their biological legacy. The crowd's appetite for novelty meant that gladiators were constantly being pushed to new extremes. Standard combat became routine, so organizers introduced variations. Gladiators might be forced to fight blindfolded, or with their offhand, or while wounded from previous battles. Some were given inferior weapons, creating deliberately uneven matches that were more execution than combat. The beast hunts, the venaciones, represented perhaps the most degrading form of gladiatorial combat. Men were thrown into the arena with wild animals, expected to fight lions, tigers, bears, and other predators for the crowd's amusement. These weren't fair fights. They were elaborate forms of execution disguised as entertainment. The animals were often starved beforehand to make them more aggressive, while the humans were given minimal weapons and no real chance of survival. But here's what makes it even more horrific. Some of these beast fighters were volunteers, free men who had fallen so far into debt or desperation that fighting wild animals seemed like their best option. Imagine being so broken by life that facing a hungry lion felt like a reasonable career choice. That's the level of desperation that Roman society created in its lower classes. The naval battles, the naumachia, were another form of spectacular murder. The arena would be flooded, ships would be brought in, and gladiators would be forced to fight naval battles for the crowd's entertainment. These men, many of whom had never seen the ocean, were expected to sail, fight, and die, while thousands watched from the safety of the stands. The water turned red with blood, and the crowd cheered as if they were watching a thrilling naval engagement rather than mass murder. The psychological impact on the spectators themselves is worth considering. Modern research on violence suggests that witnessing brutality can desensitize people to suffering, making them more likely to accept cruelty as normal. Roman society was systematically training its citizens to enjoy human suffering, to see violence as entertainment, to value spectacle over human life. The gladiator games weren't just destroying the men in the arena, they were corrupting the souls of everyone who watched. Children were brought to these games as part of their education. They learned that human life was cheap, that violence was acceptable if it was officially sanctioned, that the suffering of others was entertaining. These lessons would shape them into adults who could continue the cycle, who could watch men die without feeling empathy or revulsion. The economic incentives were all wrong. In modern sports, athletes are valuable and protected because they generate revenue through their continued participation. A UFC fighter who gets injured receives medical care designed to get them back to fighting as soon as possible, but also to preserve their long-term health. A gladiator was valuable only as long as he could die entertainingly. Once he was too injured to fight effectively, he became a liability to be disposed of. The training facilities themselves were designed to break the human spirit. The cells were deliberately uncomfortable, the food inadequate, the punishment severe. But perhaps most insidiously, the gladiators were taught to compete with each other for small privileges, better food, slightly larger cells, fewer beatings. These tiny improvements were given to fighters who showed promise, creating a hierarchy of suffering that turned victims against each other. The medical care available to gladiators was a grotesque parody of healing. Roman physicians developed sophisticated techniques for treating sword wounds, not out of compassion, but out of economic necessity. They learned to stitch flesh, set bones, and treat trauma with the same cold efficiency they might use on a valuable livestock. The famous physician Galen advanced medical knowledge by studying gladiator wounds, but his interest was scientific, not humanitarian. Pain management was primitive and often counterproductive. Gladiators might be given wine mixed with herbs before fights, substances that dulled sensation but also slowed reflexes. Others were given stimulants that increased aggression but also made them more likely to take fatal risks. The goal was never the gladiator's well-being, it was always the quality of the entertainment. The armor and weapons were designed for spectacle rather than protection. A retiarius fought nearly naked, his body exposed to both weapons and the crowd's gaze. A secutor was encased in heavy bronze that limited his vision and movement. A thrax wore elaborate but ultimately ineffective decorative armor. All of it was calculated to create specific types of combat, specific visual effects when blood was spilled. The referee system was a joke. The summa rudis was supposed to ensure fair play, but his real job was to keep the action moving, to prevent fighters from being too defensive, to make sure the crowd got the blood they had paid to see. A gladiator who tried to protect himself, who fought defensively, might find himself facing fresh opponents until he became more aggressive or died trying. The crowd's behavior during these games reveals something deeply disturbing about human nature. These weren't barbarians or primitives. They were citizens of one of history's most advanced civilizations. They had literature, philosophy, engineering marvels, yet they could sit in comfortable seats, eating snacks and drinking wine while human beings were butchered in front of them. The normalization of brutality was so complete that murder became as routine as theatre. The betting culture surrounding gladiator games was extensive and sophisticated. Romans would wager on everything: which gladiator would win, how long the fight would last, whether a defeated fighter would be spared by the crowd. Imagine being reduced to statistics in someone else's gambling addiction. Your life literally became a commodity to be bought, sold, and wagered upon by people who saw you as less than human. The sexual exploitation of gladiators added another layer of degradation to their already horrific existence. Some wealthy Roman women would pay for private encounters with famous gladiators, seeing them as exotic and dangerous lovers. These men, already stripped of their freedom and dignity, were further reduced to sexual objects. They had no right to refuse, no agency over their own bodies. Even their sexuality belonged to their owners. The gladiator schools operated like factories for producing human weapons. The lanista calculated the costs of acquisition, training, feeding, and housing gladiators against the profits from renting them out for games. If a gladiator showed promise, he might receive slightly better treatment, but this was investment protection, not compassion. The business model was based on the systematic destruction of human beings for profit. The training regimen was designed to break down natural human reluctance to kill. Gladiators were forced to practice on each other, to hurt men they lived alongside, to overcome their instinctive empathy. The trainers used a combination of brutalization, conditioning, and psychological manipulation to create killers who would perform on command. It was a systematic destruction of human conscience, a deliberate corruption of natural morality. Some gladiators were drugged before fights, given substances that would increase aggression and dull pain. Others were deliberately provoked with insults about their families, their homelands, their masculine honor. The goal was to create fighters who would engage fully in combat, who would give the crowd the blood and drama they craved, rather than simply trying to survive. The weapons themselves were works of art, ornate and deadly. Unlike the practical weapons of the Roman legions, gladiator equipment was designed for spectacle. A retiarius's trident was decorated with engravings, a circuitor's helmet bore elaborate crests, a thraex's sword was curved and polished to gleam in the sunlight. These beautiful instruments of death were crafted to enhance the visual impact of combat, to make murder more aesthetically pleasing. The religious aspects of gladiator combat were deeply cynical. The fights were held during religious festivals, supposedly honoring the gods. But what kind of deity would be pleased by the systematic murder of innocent men? The religious justification was a thin veneer over what was essentially ritualized murder for entertainment. The gods were being honored with human sacrifice disguised as sport. The gladiator's relationship with death was unlike anything in human experience. Modern soldiers fight for causes they believe in, with comrades they trust, for countries they love. A gladiator fought for the entertainment of strangers, against men who were as much victims as he was, for an empire that saw him as expendable. Death wasn't the enemy. It was the only escape from a system designed to destroy the human spirit. The psychological profile of a gladiator would be recognized today as severe PTSD. They suffered from nightmares, hypervigilance, survivor's guilt, and social isolation. But Roman society had no understanding of mental health, no treatment for psychological trauma. These men were expected to simply endure their suffering in silence, to be grateful for the opportunity to die for entertainment. The few gladiators who achieved freedom through the Rudes faced a different kind of hell. They had been trained for years to kill, had their personalities shaped by violence and death. They had no marketable skills outside of combat, no social connections beyond the arena. Many struggled to adapt to civilian life, haunted by the men they'd killed and the friends they'd lost. Freedom, when it came, was often hollow and meaningless. The gladiator's family, if he had one, suffered alongside him. Wives and children of gladiators lived in constant fear, knowing that any day might bring news of their loved one's death. They couldn't plan for the future, couldn't hope for a normal life. The gladiator's slavery extended its shadow over everyone who cared about him, creating generations of trauma and suffering. The seasonal nature of the games meant that gladiators lived in constant uncertainty. They might go months without fighting, their anxiety building as they waited for their name to be called. Or they might fight multiple times in a single day, their survival becoming increasingly unlikely with each encounter. The unpredictability was part of the psychological torture, a deliberate strategy to keep them off balance and desperate, and so we see the full horror of the gladiator's existence, not just the physical danger of combat, but the systematic destruction of hope, dignity, and humanity. These men were not warriors or athletes, they were human sacrifices on the altar of Roman entertainment, their lives ground up in the machinery of imperial spectacle. They lived and died, not as heroes, but as commodities, their suffering transformed into profit and pleasure for an empire that had lost its soul. As you rest now in your warm bed, free to choose your dreams and wake to a world where your life belongs to you, remember these men who never had such luxury. Their story is a reminder of what happens when we lose sight of our common humanity, when we allow entertainment to become more important than empathy, when we reduce other human beings to objects for our amusement. Sleep well, knowing that you live in a world where such spectacles are history, not reality, and where human dignity is not just a privilege, but a right. The gladiators' final moments were choreographed like a dance of death, every gesture calculated for maximum emotional impact on the crowd. When defeat became inevitable, when the blood loss was too great, or the wounds too severe, the dying gladiator was expected to perform one last act for his audience. He would kneel in the sand, look up at the editor's box, and wait for the gesture that would seal his fate. This moment, frozen in countless Hollywood films, was the culmination of years of psychological conditioning. The gladiator had been trained not just to fight, but to die well, to show courage in his final moments, to accept death with dignity, to give the crowd one last thrill before his light went out forever. Even in death, he was performing for people who had never known his name, never cared about his dreams, never wondered about the life he might have lived if he'd been born free. The crowd's reaction to these final moments reveals the depths of their moral corruption. They would cheer for a good death, applaud a gladiator who died bravely, remember fondly a fighter who showed style in his final moments. But they never questioned the system that made such deaths necessary. They never asked why entertainment required human sacrifice, why their pleasure demanded someone else's agony. Modern athletes face pressure too, of course. The weight of expectations, the fear of failure, the knowledge that careers can end with a single injury. But imagine if that pressure included the literal possibility of death, if failure meant not just disappointment, but a sword through your chest while strangers cheered. The psychological burden would be beyond human comprehension. The gladiator, who received the crowd's mercy, whose life was spared by a thumbs-up gesture, faced a different kind of horror. He had to live with the knowledge that strangers had decided he was worth keeping alive for a few more months, that his existence had been reduced to a popularity contest among people who saw him as entertainment. The mercy wasn't compassion. It was a stay of execution, a temporary reprieve that only delayed the inevitable. Think about the mathematics of survival. Even if a gladiator had a 70% chance of winning each individual fight, the odds of surviving 10 fights dropped to less than 3%. 20 fights, the probability became virtually zero. The system wasn't designed to create survivors. It was designed to consume human lives at a steady, predictable rate. The gladiator schools understood this arithmetic perfectly. They trained far more men than they expected to survive, knowing that most would die within their first year. The investment in training was calculated against the expected lifespan of each fighter. A gladiator was profitable if he survived long enough to pay back his training costs, but keeping him alive longer than necessary was simply bad business. The few gladiators who achieved genuine fame found themselves trapped in a different kind of cage. Their popularity made them valuable, which meant they were protected and pampered in some ways. Better food, private cells, even conjugal visits with slave women. But it also meant they were too valuable to release, too profitable to let retire. Fame became another form of slavery, golden chains that bound them to the arena until death finally freed them. The star gladiators were marketed like modern celebrities, their images painted on pottery, their names chanted by crowds. But this fame was built on their ability to kill other human beings entertainingly. They were celebrities of murder, their popularity measured in the number of men they'd slaughtered for public amusement. The cognitive dissonance must have been overwhelming. The psychological impact on the guards and trainers is worth considering too. These men spent their days preparing other human beings for death, teaching them to kill, watching them die. Many were former gladiators themselves, men who had somehow survived long enough to earn this slightly less deadly position. They lived with the knowledge that they were complicit in a system of human destruction, that their expertise was being used to create better killers. The medical staff faced similar moral challenges. Roman doctors who treated gladiators became skilled at trauma surgery, at treating wounds that would be fatal without immediate intervention. But they were healing these men only so they could be sent back to die more spectacularly. The Hippocratic Oath, first, do no harm, became meaningless when the harm was the entire point of the system. The gladiator's equipment was maintained with more care than the gladiator himself. Weapons were sharpened to perfection, armor polished to gleam in the sunlight, everything designed to create the most visually striking combat possible. The tools of death received better treatment than the men who wielded them. The irony was lost on no one, least of all the gladiators themselves. The recycling of equipment after each death was particularly demoralizing. The sword that killed your friend might be cleaned and handed to you for your next fight. The armor that failed to protect one man would be strapped onto another. Nothing was wasted except human life, which was the cheapest and most replaceable commodity in the empire. The crowd's bloodlust was carefully cultivated and maintained. The games began with lesser fights, condemned criminals against wild animals, to warm up the audience. Then came the main events, the gladiator combats that everyone had paid to see. The progression was designed to build excitement, to increase the crowd's appetite for violence until they were screaming for blood. The betting reached fever pitch during the main events. Romans would wager their family fortunes on the outcome of fights, treating human lives as nothing more than variables in their gambling equations. The gladiators were aware of this, knew that their deaths or survival would determine whether strangers went home rich or poor. They were literally dying for other people's entertainment and profit. The social dynamics of the crowd were fascinating and horrifying. Upper-class Romans would sit in the best seats, their refined sensibilities somehow untroubled by the carnage before them. They would discuss philosophy and literature between fights, then cheer enthusiastically when a gladiator's blood splattered the sand. The disconnect between their cultural sophistication and their moral bankruptcy was complete. Women in the crowd were often the most bloodthirsty, their screams for violence sometimes drowning out the men's voices. Roman society restricted women's roles in many ways, but in the arena, they were free to express their darkest impulses. They could demand death, cheer for blood, revel in violence without social consequences. The gladiator games became an outlet for societal repression, a place where normal moral constraints were suspended. The children in the audience were perhaps the most tragic figures of all. They were being educated in cruelty, taught that human suffering was acceptable if it was officially sanctioned. They learned to cheer for death, to see violence as entertainment, to value spectacle over empathy. These lessons would shape them into adults who could continue the cycle, who could watch men die without feeling revulsion or compassion. The aftermath of each day's games saw the arena transformed back into an empty space, all evidence of the carnage carefully removed. The sand was raked smooth, the blood washed away, the bodies disposed of in mass graves outside the city. Within hours, the space where men had died was clean and ready for the next spectacle. The normalization of violence was so complete that murder left no lasting mark on the place where it occurred. The gladiator's death was often quick, but not always merciful. A sword thrust to the heart was considered the ideal death, fast and relatively painless. But fights didn't always end so cleanly. Men died slowly from blood loss, from infections, from wounds that festered in the filthy conditions of the holding cells. Some fought multiple opponents in a single day, their bodies accumulating damage until they could no longer stand. The crowd's reaction to these prolonged deaths was telling. They would grow restless if a gladiator took too long to die, bored by suffering that wasn't spectacular enough. They wanted drama, not drawn-out agony. The gladiator's pain was only valuable if it entertained them. Otherwise, it was just an inconvenience that delayed the next fight. The seasonal nature of the games created a rhythm of death that punctuated the Roman calendar. Spring brought new gladiators, fresh from training or captured in recent wars. Summer saw the peak season, with games held during religious festivals and imperial celebrations. Fall was the time for clearing out the wounded and weak, making room for the next year's crop of fighters. Winter brought a brief respite, but also the knowledge that spring would bring more death. The gladiator's relationship with time was fundamentally different from ours. Modern people plan for the future, make long-term goals, invest in relationships that will last decades. A gladiator lived in the eternal present, knowing that each day might be his last, that planning for tomorrow was a luxury he couldn't afford. This temporal compression created a unique form of psychological torture, a constant awareness of mortality that made normal human experiences impossible. The religious aspects of gladiator combat were deeply cynical. The fights were held during religious festivals, supposedly honoring the gods with displays of courage and martial skill. But what kind of deity would be pleased by the systematic murder of innocent men? The religious justification was a thin veneer over what was essentially ritualized murder for entertainment. Some gladiators found solace in religion, praying to their ancestral gods for strength or a quick death. Others lost faith entirely, unable to reconcile the existence of benevolent deities with their own suffering. The arena was a place where faith went to die, where the randomness of survival made divine justice seem like a cruel joke. The gladiator's legacy was written in blood and quickly forgotten. Unlike modern athletes who are remembered for their achievements, gladiators were remembered only for their deaths. The spectacular nature of their final moments might earn them a brief mention in the historical record, but their lives, their personalities, their dreams were erased as completely as their blood was washed from the sand. The system's efficiency was its most horrifying aspect. Every element was designed to maximize the production of entertaining deaths while minimizing costs. The training was just thorough enough to create skilled fighters, the medical care just adequate to keep them alive until they could die spectacularly, the equipment just effective enough to create good combat. It was industrial-scale murder disguised as entertainment. The Gladiator story is ultimately one of human resilience in the face of systematic dehumanization. These men found ways to maintain their dignity, to care for each other, to hold on to fragments of their humanity, even as the system tried to strip them of everything that made them human. Their courage wasn't the theatrical bravery of Hollywood heroes. It was the quiet determination to remain human in an inhuman situation. As you rest now in your comfortable bed, free to choose your dreams, and wake to a world where your life belongs to you, remember these men who never had such luxury. They lived and died in a system that valued their deaths more than their lives, that turned human suffering into public entertainment, that reduced human beings to commodities in a marketplace of death. The arena stands empty now, its sand long since scattered by the winds of time. But the echoes of their suffering remain, a reminder of what happens when we lose sight of our common humanity, when we allow entertainment to become more important than empathy. Sleep well, knowing that you live in a world where such spectacles are history, not reality, and where human dignity is not just a privilege, but a right that belongs to all. The gladiator who survived his first fight faced a cruel irony that modern combat sports can barely comprehend. Today's UFC fighters experience the rush of victory, the validation of success, the knowledge that they've proven their skills against worthy opponents. But a gladiator's first victory was tainted by a horror that would haunt him for whatever remained of his life. He had killed another human being for the entertainment of strangers. Picture that moment after your first kill. The crowd is cheering. Your opponent lies bleeding in the sand, and you're standing there with a sword in your hand, realizing that you've just crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. The man you killed might have been a fellow prisoner, someone you'd shared meals with, someone who had told you about his family back home. Now he's dead, and you're the one who killed him. The psychological impact was devastating. Modern soldiers who kill in combat often struggle with PTSD, but they're fighting for their country, for their comrades, for causes they believe in. A gladiator killed for the amusement of people who saw him as less than human. There was no noble purpose, no greater good, just the simple equation that someone had to die for the crowd's entertainment. And today, it wasn't him. The victory celebrations were grotesque mockeries of achievement. The gladiator might receive a palm branch, a few coins, perhaps some wine. The crowd would cheer his name, shower him with praise, treat him like a hero. But he knew the truth. He was being celebrated for murder, applauded for taking a life that had value to someone, somewhere. The cheers felt like accusations, the praise like condemnation. Sleep became impossible after that first kill. The gladiator would lie in his cell, staring at the stone ceiling, seeing his opponent's face in the shadows. He'd replay the moment over and over, wondering if he could have done something different, if there had been another way, but there hadn't been. The system was designed to force men to kill each other, and he had simply been better at it than his opponent. The other gladiators would treat him differently now. He was no longer a novice, no longer someone who might hesitate at the crucial moment. He had proven he could kill, which made him both more valuable and more dangerous. Friendships became strained, conversations stilted. Everyone knew that tomorrow, next week, next month, they might face each other across the sand. The training changed after that first victory. The doctors would push him harder, teach him more advanced techniques, prepare him for more challenging opponents. Success in the arena was rewarded with more opportunities to succeed, which meant more chances to kill or be killed. Victory became a trap, each win ensuring that the next fight would be even deadlier. The crowd's expectations grew with each survival. They remembered his name now, had favorites among the fighters, would bet on his matches with increasing enthusiasm, but their affection was conditional. based entirely on his ability to provide entertaining deaths. The moment he stopped being spectacular, the moment he hesitated or showed mercy, their love would turn to disappointment and then to bloodlust. The gladiator's relationship with his weapons became deeply personal and deeply troubling. The sword that had killed his first opponent would be cleaned and returned to him for future fights. He would hold it, feel its weight, remember the moment it had pierced human flesh. The weapon became an extension of his guilt, a constant reminder of what he had done and would be forced to do again. The medical staff would treat his wounds with professional efficiency, but they would also study him with clinical interest. How had he survived when others hadn't? What techniques had he used? What weaknesses had he exploited? He was becoming a case study in successful killing. His methods analyzed and taught to other gladiators who would use them to kill in turn. The lanista would calculate his new value, adjust his training regimen, perhaps improve his living conditions slightly. But these improvements were investments, not rewards. A gladiator who had proven he could win was worth more money, commanded higher fees when rented out for games. His success had made him a more valuable commodity, not a more valued human being. The crowd's reaction to his victories revealed the depths of their moral corruption. They would cheer not just for his skill, but for the artistry of his kills. A clean thrust to the heart was appreciated, but a more elaborate death was truly celebrated. They wanted theatre, drama, spectacle. The gladiator learned to provide it, to make his kills more entertaining, more visually striking. The betting became more sophisticated as gladiators gained reputations. People would wager not just on who would win, but on how the fight would end, how long it would last, whether the defeated fighter would be spared. The gladiator's life became a series of variables in other people's gambling equations, his fate literally determined by the odds. The sexual attention that came with fame was another form of degradation. Wealthy Roman women would seek out successful gladiators, seeing them as dangerous, exotic lovers. But these encounters were not consensual in any meaningful sense. The gladiator had no right to refuse, no agency over his own body. He was a sexual commodity as much as a fighting one, his masculinity another form of entertainment for the wealthy. The fan culture that developed around successful gladiators was deeply disturbing. People would paint their names on walls, create crude sculptures of them, even name their children after them. But this adoration was based on their ability to kill other human beings entertainingly. They were celebrities of murder, their fame built on a foundation of corpses. The gladiator's perception of time became distorted by the constant proximity to death. Modern people plan for the future, make long-term goals, invest in relationships that will last decades. A gladiator lived in the eternal present, knowing that each day might be his last, that planning for tomorrow was a luxury he couldn't afford. This temporal compression created a unique form of psychological torture. The seasonal rhythm of the games created a predictable cycle of death that punctuated the Roman calendar. Spring brought new gladiators, fresh from training or captured in recent wars. Summer saw the peak season, with games held during religious festivals and imperial celebrations. Fall was the time for clearing out the wounded and weak, making room for the next year's crop of fighters. Winter brought a brief respite, but also the knowledge that spring would bring more death. The gladiator's relationship with his own mortality was unlike anything in human experience. Modern soldiers face death in combat, but they're fighting for causes they believe in, with comrades they trust, for countries they love. A gladiator faced death for the entertainment of strangers, against men who were as much victims as he was, for an empire that saw him as expendable. The few gladiators who achieved genuine fame found themselves trapped in a different kind of cage. Their popularity made them valuable, which meant they were protected and pampered in some ways. Better food, private cells, even conjugal visits with slave women. But it also meant they were too valuable to release, too profitable to let retire. Fame became another form of slavery, golden chains that bound them to the arena until death finally freed them. The star gladiators were marketed like modern celebrities, their images painted on pottery, their names chanted by crowds. But this fame was built on their ability to kill other human beings entertainingly. They were celebrities of murder, their popularity measured in the number of men they'd slaughtered for public amusement. The cognitive dissonance must have been overwhelming. The psychological conditioning was so complete that some gladiators began to identify with their captors, to take pride in their skills as killers, to see themselves as warriors rather than victims. This Stockholm syndrome was encouraged by the system, which needed gladiators who would fight enthusiastically rather than simply trying to survive. The better a gladiator became at killing, the more likely he was to survive, creating a perverse incentive structure. The gladiator's dreams, when he could manage to sleep, were haunted by the faces of the men he'd killed. They would visit him in the darkness, asking why he had survived when they had not. There was no answer to give them, no justification that made sense. He had lived because he had been better at killing, luckier in combat, more willing to do whatever was necessary to survive. The guilt was overwhelming and inescapable. The medical treatments available to successful gladiators were more sophisticated than those given to novices, but they were still purely utilitarian. A gladiator who had proven his worth would receive better care for his wounds, more attention to his physical condition, even primitive forms of pain management. But this wasn't compassion, it was investment protection. A successful gladiator was worth more money, and his owners wanted to maintain their valuable property. The training regimen for proven gladiators was more intense and specialized. They would be matched against specific types of opponents, taught to exploit particular weaknesses, given access to better equipment and more experienced trainers. But this advanced training was just another form of imprisonment, another way of ensuring that they would continue to kill efficiently until they were finally killed themselves. The gladiator's relationship with the crowd became more complex as his fame grew. He learned to read their moods, to understand what they wanted, to give them the spectacle they craved. But he also came to hate them, to see them as the true enemy, the ones who demanded his suffering for their entertainment. The crowd's cheers became a form of torture, a constant reminder of his degradation. The few gladiators who managed to retire with the rudis, the wooden sword of freedom, found that their liberation was hollow. They had been trained for years to kill, had their personalities shaped by violence and death. They had no marketable skills outside of combat, no social connections beyond the arena. Many struggled to adapt to civilian life, haunted by the men they'd killed and the friends they'd lost. The gladiator's legacy was written in blood and quickly forgotten. Unlike modern athletes who are remembered for their achievements, gladiators were remembered only for their deaths. The spectacular nature of their final moments might earn them a brief mention in the historical record, but their lives, their personalities, their dreams were erased as completely as their blood was washed from the sand. The system's efficiency was its most horrifying aspect. Every element was designed to maximize the production of entertaining deaths while minimizing costs. The training was just thorough enough to create skilled fighters, the medical care just adequate to keep them alive until they could die spectacularly, the equipment just effective enough to create good combat. It was industrial-scale murder disguised as entertainment. The gladiator's story is ultimately one of human resilience in the face of systematic dehumanization. These men found ways to maintain their dignity, to care for each other, to hold on to fragments of their humanity even as the system tried to strip them of everything that made them human. Their courage wasn't the theatrical bravery of Hollywood heroes, it was the quiet determination to remain human in an inhuman situation. As the night deepens around you, as you rest in the safety of your own bed, remember these men who never knew such comfort. They lived and died in a world where human life was cheap, where death was entertainment, where the crowd's roar was often the last sound a man would hear. Their suffering was not incidental to their purpose. It was the entire point of their existence. The arena stands empty now, its sand long since scattered by the winds of time. But the echoes of their anguish remain, a reminder of what happens when we lose sight of our common humanity, when we allow entertainment to become more important than empathy. Sleep peacefully, knowing that you live in a world where such spectacles are history, not reality, and where human dignity is not just a privilege, but a right that belongs to all. The gladiators' long battle is over, but their story continues to teach us about the value of human life and the dangers of treating others as objects for our amusement. Rest now, and let their memory be a gentle reminder of how precious your freedom truly is. Tomorrow we'll explore the few who dared to resist, but tonight, let the weight of their sacrifice settle softly into your dreams. The few gladiators who dared to resist the system faced horrors that make their regular existence seem almost merciful by comparison. But resistance, when it came, burned with a fierce light that illuminated the depths of human courage, even in the most hopeless circumstances. The most famous rebellion, led by Spartacus in 73 BCE, began not with grand speeches or elaborate planning, but with a simple act of desperation. Spartacus, a Thracian who had once fought as a free warrior against Roman legions, found himself enslaved and forced to train at the gladiator school of Lentulus Batiatus in Capua. He had tasted freedom, had led men in battle for causes he believed in, and the psychological torture of his new existence proved unbearable. The initial escape was almost pathetically small. Spartacus and 77 other gladiators broke out of their school using kitchen knives and cooking implements as weapons. They weren't heroes in gleaming armor. They were desperate men armed with whatever they could find, fleeing into the countryside with nothing but their lives and their rage. Modern prison breaks are planned with sophisticated tools and careful timing. The gladiators had soup ladles and the knowledge that capture meant death. But something extraordinary happened. As word spread that gladiators had successfully escaped, that the system could be challenged, other slaves began to join them. Agricultural workers, household servants, men who had never held a sword but who shared the common bond of being treated as property. The rebellion grew not through military strategy, but through the simple human desire for freedom spreading like wildfire through the oppressed populations of southern Italy. Within months, Spartacus commanded an army of over 100,000 followers. Think about that transformation. A gladiator trained to die for entertainment had become a general leading one of the largest slave revolts in human history. These weren't professional soldiers. They were desperate people who had discovered that death in battle for their own freedom was preferable to death in the arena for someone else's amusement. The Roman response was swift and brutal. At first, they sent small forces, assuming that a rabble of slaves could be easily crushed. But Spartacus had learned more than just sword work in the gladiator schools. He had studied tactics, leadership, the psychology of men under extreme pressure. He used the Romans' own contempt against them, turning their assumption of superiority into a strategic advantage. The early victories were stunning. Spartacus defeated Roman armies, captured their weapons and equipment, and began training his followers in proper military techniques. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed possible that the impossible might happen. Slaves might defeat their masters. The oppressed might overthrow their oppressors. Gladiators might transform from victims into victors. But the Roman Empire was not built on mercy or fairness. It was built on the systematic application of overwhelming force, and when that force was finally brought to bear, the result was inevitable. Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest and most ruthless generals, was given command of 8 legions and unlimited authority to crush the rebellion by any means necessary. The final battle was a slaughter. Spartacus died fighting, his body never found among the thousands of corpses that littered the battlefield. His followers, Men who had fought for the radical idea that human beings should not be property were crucified along the Appian Way. 6,000 crosses lined the road from Capua to Rome, each bearing the body of someone who had dared to dream of freedom. The crucifixions were not just executions, they were a message. Every traveller on that road would see the price of resistance, the cost of challenging the system. The bodies were left to rot, to be picked clean by birds and insects, to serve as a permanent reminder that the empire would tolerate no defiance, no matter how justified. But here's what makes the story even more tragic. The gladiators who survived the rebellion weren't freed. They were sent back to the schools, back to the arena, back to dying for entertainment. Their brief taste of freedom, their moment of hope, was erased as completely as if it had never happened. The system simply absorbed their resistance and continued functioning. The psychological impact on the surviving gladiators was devastating. They had seen what was possible, had experienced the intoxicating rush of fighting for their own cause rather than someone else's entertainment. Now they were back in their cells, back to the gruel and the beatings, and the knowledge that tomorrow might bring another death for the crowd's amusement. The despair must have been overwhelming. Modern athletes who lose important competitions face disappointment, setbacks, the need to train harder for next time. A gladiator who survived Spartacus's rebellion faced the knowledge that his moment of hope had been crushed, that the system was too powerful to challenge, that he would die as he had lived, as property, as entertainment, as something less than human. The Roman authorities learned from the rebellion too. Security at gladiator schools was increased. Training was monitored more closely, and any sign of potential uprising was crushed immediately. The brief window of opportunity that had allowed Spartacus to escape was sealed shut. Future gladiators would find resistance even more difficult, even more hopeless. Yet resistance continued, smaller acts of defiance that history barely remembers. Gladiators who refused to kill defeated opponents, who turned their weapons on the crowd instead of each other, who chose suicide rather than continued slavery. These acts accomplished nothing strategically, changed nothing systematically, but they preserved something essential: the knowledge that even in the most hopeless circumstances, human beings could choose dignity over survival. The gladiator system finally ended not through rebellion or moral awakening, but through the simple economics of empire. As Rome expanded and conquered new territories, the supply of prisoners for the arena decreased. The cost of maintaining gladiator schools increased, while the novelty of the spectacle decreased. Eventually, other forms of entertainment became more popular, more profitable, more practical. The last gladiator games were held in 435 CE, more than 4 centuries after Spartacus's rebellion. The men who died in those final contests were no different from those who had died in the first games centuries earlier. They were still slaves, still property, still dying for the entertainment of people who saw them as less than human. The system had simply outlived its usefulness. The gladiator schools were converted to other purposes or abandoned entirely. The weapons were melted down, the training equipment discarded, the cells left empty. Within a generation, the entire apparatus of human sacrifice disguised as entertainment had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. The empire moved on to other spectacles, other forms of cruelty, other ways of demonstrating its power over human life. But the memory of the gladiators lingers, not as heroes or villains, but as a reminder of what human beings can endure and what they can become when reduced to objects for others' amusement. Their story teaches us that the capacity for both cruelty and courage exists in every society, that the distance between civilization and barbarism is shorter than we'd like to believe. As you rest now in your comfortable bed, free to choose your dreams and wake to a world where your life belongs to you, remember these men who never had such luxury. They lived and died in a system that valued their deaths more than their lives, that turned human suffering into public entertainment, that reduced human beings to commodities in a marketplace of death. The arena stands empty now, its sand long since scattered by the winds of time. The crowds have gone home, the gladiators have found their rest, and the empire that created such spectacles has crumbled into dust. But the echoes of their suffering remain, a reminder of what happens when we lose sight of our common humanity, when we allow entertainment to become more important than empathy. Sleep well, knowing that you live in a world where such spectacles are history, not reality, and where human dignity is not just a privilege, but a right that belongs to all. The gladiators' long battle is finally over, but their story continues to teach us about the value of human life and the dangers of treating others as objects for our amusement. Rest now, and let their memory be a gentle reminder of how precious your freedom truly is. Tomorrow will bring new stories, new journeys through history's darker corners, but tonight, the arena is quiet, the sand is still, and peace has finally come to those who suffered for so long in the name of entertainment. The gladiators' tale is told, their sacrifice remembered, their humanity acknowledged at last. Sleep peacefully, dear listener, and dream of a world where such cruelty is impossible, where human life is sacred, and where the roar of the crowd celebrates achievement rather than demanding death.